just as a little background, we'll start off here, and we'll look at the period before this standing rivalry between France and England. And this is going back to the Middle Ages, the 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc. I mean, France and England have been at war on and off for centuries and centuries. And when the New World was discovered, both laid claims in Americas. You had the French more in modern Canada, the British in America. You had the Spanish in Florida, modern-day Mexico, the Caribbean. And as you can see in this map, also there's some Russian claims out in Alaska. You would have Portuguese claims in South America. So there's a long-standing rivalry, and all these groups are coming to a head in what's going to be known as the 7 Years' War. Now, this is essentially a world war, one of the first real world wars that was fought. Prussia would be involved, the Netherlands would be involved, France, England, Russia, Spain. You're going to have essentially fighting going on across the world, as we'll see. Also known as the 7 Years' War, but in America, we call it the French-Indian War, just because that's just going to focus on the conflicts going on here in the modern-day United States and Canada, and how that came to affect America. The main causes of the fighting here, for our purposes, we're looking at a lot of French forts being built in the Ohio River Valley. And the thing is, England and France both believed that this area, sort of the Midwest, just west of the Appalachian Mountains in the modern America, both of them thought they had claims to that area. They both had their North American claims. So the French start building these forts, and they have fairly good relationships with the American Indian groups out there. They're trading with them. The fur trade was flourishing. It was bringing great wealth to there, and these forts would be the scene of trading with American Indian and French traders. Well, the English believe they have a claim to that region as well, and as the population is growing in the east, this land is seen as its great farmland. It's also seen as cheap land, and a region for more where people can push out to the west and have cheaper farmland and bigger farms and to head out that way. So the population is growing, and it's really pushing further out there to the west. And you see some of these forts, the blue ones are the French forts, like Fort Labour, Fort Marchal, and then the British are going to start building some forts that are going to come into play in this war, including Fort Necessity, especially Fort Duquesne will see a conflict as well. And it's all going to start with this young man right here. You may not recognize him from that painting, but that is George Washington, a very young George Washington, 21 years old, heads out into that force in the western Pennsylvania, Ohio area to kind of settle this dispute. Now, the governor of Virginia believes that this area is part of an English claim, and that they have a claim on this area, and he's sent Washington to deliver a message to tell the French to get out, to abandon their forts, and that this is English territory and to leave. George Washington is young and ambitious, and he's just 21 years old. He heads out to do that. Things do not go well for young George Washington. He's sort of rebuffed with his claim when he first meets a French general in charge of a fort and told to go back and, no, I'm not giving up this fort. You're ridiculous. Get out of here. And so he's sent on his way, and then he later wants to try to capture Fort Duquesne in modern-day Pittsburgh, but he's defeated there, and it's sort of a slaughter. A lot of his men are killed. They retreat. They start to build a fort known as Fort Necessity. You can imagine the name. They saw it necessary to really build a fort quickly for their own protection. However, at Fort Necessity, he is defeated by an alliance of French and American Indian groups. He is forced to sign a fairly humiliating agreement as part of his surrender, saying that he was responsible for the murder of this French general who was killed by an American Indian ally of George Washington's in a fairly brutal manner with a tomahawk. And he's sort of forced to admit this, and Washington didn't even speak French, but he signed this agreement that was all in French, so it's debatable about how much he even understood that he was signing. And this is really not a good start for either George Washington's career or the British in the French and Indian War. And here is that scene there of Washington and his council at Fort Necessity sort of gathering together to withdraw after some deliberation and surrender rather than likely being killed. And that really leads to war being declared. The British realize this is trouble for them, so they send a English General Edward Braddock, out there to drive the French out of the Ohio Valley in 1755. He, though, is soon defeated and killed by an ambush by American Indian groups, and that's another defeat for the British, and the British keep suffering these defeats. The French had much larger presence out there than the British did. Now, the British had obviously a great presence in the eastern United States, in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Massachusetts. But the French really had more forts out west, so they really had the upper hand to start off this conflict. And war is going to be officially declared between the two sides here in 1756. And let's just take a look at comparing these two sides here at the start of the conflict. They're each going to have different American Indian allies. The English are really close allies with the Iroquois Confederacy, whereas the French would be allied with the Algonquins, the Hurons, and the Ottawa are their more Midwestern American Indian allies. As for the colonial population, though, the British had far, far more people in the colonial United States, and we believe it's about 1 million at 1756 especially, but the large portion of them in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Virginia, down through the East Coast there. The French had a much smaller population, one reason why they had better relationships with the American Indians at the time. As far as their activities there, the French, as we mentioned, were fur traders. There were some missionaries out there and priests, but for the they were mostly trading, whereas the British had established towns, fishing industries, trading, farming, more what you'd imagine a settled area to be. Again, why they did not get along with the American Indian groups as well. They're rather than trading at trading posts like the French were. But as you mentioned, this is really a global conflict, and while we're focusing just on the conflict in America, this was going on across the world, and here you see the global allies on each side, with Great Britain, Prussia, and Portugal allied versus France, Spain, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and you can even see some of the conflict into the colonies in the Far East and in India getting involved as well. Well, some of the early conflicts in the French-Indian War, the French are going to have some major victories to start off. They capture British forts in Lake Ontario, in Lake George. This is in upstate New York. Much of the fighting that we're going to see is going to be in upstate New York, and especially, as you'd imagine, on that Canadian border, since that's where these two sides really meet. The French, their American Indian allies, are going to raid farms from New York and the Virginia frontiers, which is really harassing the colonists and is going to get more colonists involved in this conflict. And what's going to happen is that the farms and houses that are going to be burned, many of those either get involved in the conflict or they actually flee further to the East Coast for protection to get away from really the fronts of the Western Front of this conflict. And as we mentioned, the French have major victories early on in this war. They're really winning it for the first few years. Here we see an engraving. This is British forces under fire, retreating there, getting shot as they run away from French and American Indian forces. This is at Monongahela. This was the battle that saw the British. They tried to capture Fort Duquesne, modern-day Pittsburgh, but they were repulsed, defeated, and forced to flee. Some early battles are Fort Oswego. The Battle of Fort Oswego, that was a French victory in 1756. The French General Montcalm captured this Fort Oswego, New York. He captured about 1,700 soldiers and prisoners, 120-something cannons. Major victory for the French. Another victory was at the Battle of Fort William Henry. It's also known as the Siege of Fort William Henry. Again, that was the French General Montcalm. Winning this victory, they just bombarded this for several days and included several thousand American Indians on their side from a number of tribes who forced the surrender. But what happened was, as the British inside surrendered, the terms that they agreed to were that they would protect the British from the American Indians as the British surrendered. So as they surrendered, they said, we'll surrender, but you just got to guarantee us our protection. They're like, oh, okay, we'll guarantee your protection. However, it wasn't really successful in that either message wasn't communicated or they just ignored it, and a lot of British were attacked by American Indians as they surrendered, as they walked out of the fort. And it's described as a massacre. What happened of captured not just soldiers but men, women, children who were killed as they surrendered, and that really enraged the British. But at Ticonderoga, that's really going to where things are going to take a turn. The Battle of Fort Ticonderoga is in 1759. The British had about 11,000 men, so a huge force as they're sending more troops here. They are going to capture this Fort Ticonderoga. The French burn it to the ground, really, rather than have they actually blow it up, rather than have it be captured. And they set off this gunpowder to blow it up, and the whole thing catches fire. But the major parts of the fort, the walls, still stand, and the British capture that fort and they rebuild it. And that's really where things are going to take a turn after that, because it is in 1759. The British start referring to that year as the Annus Mirabilis, the Year of Wonders, when they start winning some actual victories. Here we see this is Fort Oswego, that battle we mentioned at the beginning, with the American Indian and French troops outside successfully attacking it under Montcalm. But things really turned for the British under William Pitt. William Pitt is a British foreign minister. He is really going to ensure that the British win. He does not want to lose. He devotes more resources and money and troops and weapons to the war in the Americas. He creates some alliances with some American Indian groups there. They develop some better strategies for the war. And when William Pitt takes over, that's when things really turn for the British. And they start winning some victories, finally. And we're still in 1759. In 1759, the British General James Wolfe, who will go on to be a hero to the British, he leads a surprise attack on Quebec. And it's going to be known as either the Battle of Quebec or the Battle on the Plains of Abraham, is the more poetic name, because it was fought on this farmland owned by a guy named Abraham. The British are going to win a major victory there. They're also going to win a victory at Fort Niagara, where they cut off the French frontier. And these are major victories in Canada and North America that are going to really give the British the upper hand in this battle. It's eventually going to lead to a French victory in the war. Here is a famous painting that came from that Battle of Quebec, or Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where we see James Wolfe dying. And, he was killed in this battle. The French General Montcalm was killed as well. James Wolfe really became a hero in part because of his victory there, and also this painting and the story of his death. Supposedly he's shot in the arm, in the chest, in the gut, and he's a battlefield, this general dying, and he really closes his eyes and says, I'm not going to make it. I'm going to die. And his men are surrounding him. And someone nearby says, "Oh, look at those soldiers running!" And General Wolfe opens his eyes and kind of comes to and says, who's running? Like he's going to get back up because he thinks it's his men that might be running. And the man says, no, the enemy runs. And he smiles and then closes his eyes again and is like, oh, thank you that I can die happy. It looked like, when he heard his men, when he thought his men were running, he was going to come to almost and start yelling at them, even though he was seconds from death. But he became a British hero. Eventually, this will lead us to the Treaty of Paris. Now, there are dozens of treaties of Paris. This one is the 1763 Treaty of Paris. It's confusing when you look at the grand scheme of history. There are so many treaties that have been signed in Paris. The 1763 Treaty of Paris is going to end the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. In the terms of the treaty, the French lost their Canadian colonies, and those would become British colonies. Canada would predominantly be owned by the British as a British colony for years and years and years, until it gained its independence after the United States did. But Montreal and Quebec still really, that region really maintains their French ancestry. You're going to have the Spanish are going to get the French territory west of the Mississippi River, and they're going to hold those claims in the Caribbean. The English are going to get French territory in Canada. They're going to get Florida, rest of some islands in the Caribbean. And really, this is a somewhat fair treaty to all sides. They all came out of it pretty well if you think about the areas that they got. I mean, the French lost Canada, but they got their territory in the Caribbean, which would really be more valuable with the sugar trade and crops that would grow there, as opposed to Canada. Much more wealth was in the Caribbean. The English obviously did well with keeping their colonies there. The Spanish are going to keep that territory in Mexico and to the west, which they would hold for years and years. So each side came out of it pretty well, except possibly the American Indians, who really had no say in any of this at all, and really came out of it probably the worst. Here's a more detailed map of the pre-war and post-war boundaries on each side, with purple being the British territory before and after. You can see how much it's grown. The French really losing that territory in Canada, but they would hold on to some territory in the Caribbean. And you see that disputed area is no longer disputed, and the Spanish have even greater territory later on. The war, though, we see a alliance of American Indian groups strike back at the British. They thought for their contributions to this conflict that they would come out of it, more well off or with some guarantees, but as we know, that will not happen. So a Chief Pontiac forms an American alliance of American Indians, some Ottawa, Huron. It was a huge alliance. Miami, Shawnee, Mingo, the Iroquois participated in this. They strike back at the British, but they're really unable to defeat them, obviously, and they're going to end the Pontiacs War ends in 1765. It's also known as Pontiacs Rebellion. They would be unsuccessful, obviously, but it really convinces the British that they issued this proclamation of 1763, telling colonists, don't go west of the Appalachian Mountains. There's too much unrest there. There's American Indian groups out there. We don't want to have to defend you and go to war again out there. But those colonists will not listen, because they're like, hey, we fought this whole war for this territory. We want it. We want to go out there. There's cheap land. There's great farmland. We want to go out there. So colonists keep going out there, which is going to cause problems. The British also, they spent a lot of money. When William Pitt dedicated England to winning this war, he spent a lot of money on it. And they're going to have to raise taxes on the colonists to pay for that war. And it's really going to increase the friction between the colonists and Great Britain. As far as American Indian groups, they are sort of inspired, even though Pontiac's War was not successful. It's really going to inspire further American Indian groups to form alliances together. There's going to be conferences hosted by the Shawnee and later American Indian leaders like Joseph Bryant, at Tecumseh are going to make similar alliances or confederacies to try to fight against the British. But This really sets the ball rolling for the American Revolution because you had colonists now disagreeing with what the British were doing in terms of raising taxes, this proclamation telling them not to go into this territory, which they wanted to do, so they're sort of rebelling against the British in that sense, which leads you to the ultimate rebellion of revolution later on. So as an exit ticket here, this is kind of a look at the territory ceded to Britain as a result of the French and Indian War. So if you had to understand ceded, it's sort of a higher level geography term or political term, but when you are ceding something, you are awarding it to. That area was awarded to Great Britain. And you can look at some of the current U.S. states in that ceded territory and the line, that proclamation of 1763 that separated that territory there. So long
questions that you're going to answer in Kid Blog. So I'm hoping that listening to him gave a more deeper understanding of the French and Indian War. It's important that you understood it. If there are any questions, go back when you get ready to answer these questions, go back to the video so that you can make the understanding this, because you need this for middle school. So go to Kid Blog and answer those 3 questions in this exit ticket. Okay? See you tomorrow for science.